8:16 a.m. August 6, 1945. A city of 350,000 people ceases to exist in 43 seconds. Not bombed, not burned, erased. 5 square miles of steel wood flesh and memory vaporized before the sound of the explosion could travel 3 city blocks. The fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure wave moved at 980 miles per hour. Every wooden structure within a mile and a half of the hypocenter did not collapse. It simply ceased to be a structure. The people standing in the open near the center were not killed. They were converted into shadows burned into stone sidewalks. Permanent. Silent. Gone. And the man who gave the order to drop that bomb was sitting in the Oval Office eating breakfast. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past, because the stories history forgot are always the most important ones. What you are about to hear is not the story of the bomb. You already know about the bomb. This is the story of what Japan's military leadership did with the information after the bomb fell, what they said, what they refused to say, and how the gap between truth and official language, a gap measured in hours and then in days, cost tens of thousands of people their lives when the second bomb fell on Nagasaki 72 hours later. This is the story of a telegraph operator named Kenji Mori, a junior medical orderly named Mikio Hirota, and 8 days in which the most powerful military institution in Asia chose to argue about vocabulary while cities burned. 8:16 a.m. The Flash. 8:27 a.m. A telegraph operator in Tokyo named Kenji Mori stares at a dead machine. He has been trying to reach Hiroshima for 11 minutes. He tries again. Static. He reroutes through Osaka. Nothing. He reroutes through Kobe. Nothing. He pushes back from his desk, walks to his supervisor, and says 4 words that will set off the most catastrophic chain of institutional failure in modern military history. Hiroshima is not responding. What happens next will cost 140,000 people their lives before December. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the duty officer on the morning of August 6th receives the first report at approximately 8:30 a.m. Communication blackout from Hiroshima. Possible air raid. Standard procedure initiated. The duty officer logs it, escalates it, and goes back to his other work. Because this is not unusual. American B-29s have disrupted communications across dozens of Japanese cities over the past 6 months. The assumption is routine. A large conventional strike. Possibly incendiary clusters. Possibly a new payload configuration. What nobody in that building understands yet is that the silence from Hiroshima is not the silence of damaged telegraph lines. It is the silence of a city that no longer exists in any form their training has prepared them to process. By 10 a.m., the reports arriving from the city's outskirts are deeply strange. Survivors reaching the edges of the destruction zone describe a single flash, no formation of bombers, no sustained raid. 1 aircraft, 2 at most. Then a wave of light that moved faster than sound, faster than thought, faster than anything a soldier trained in 1945 has a category for. The wooden buildings were not burned. They were simply gone. The people standing in the open within 2 kilometers of the city center were not wounded. They were shadows burned into stone. The duty officer escalates again. This time the reports reach general staff level. And here is where the story becomes something that should make you feel a cold and specific kind of anger. The men at general staff level are not stupid. They are not uninformed. They have access to intercepted American radio broadcasts. They have scientific advisors. Within hours of the bomb's detonation, they have translated transcripts of President Harry Truman's public statement. A statement that names the weapon, directly describes its yield in precise technical terms, and warns Japan that if its leadership does not accept surrender immediately, they could expect And Truman used these exact words, "a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." The Japanese Army's public response to all of this is a single sentence. A new type of bomb was used, causing considerable damage. That is it. That is the official statement released on the evening of August 6, 1945. While Hiroshima is still burning. While survivors are still pulling bodies from the rubble. While the smoke column above the city center is still visible from 60 miles away. Considerable damage. 5 square miles of complete obliteration. The Second Army headquarters gone. The largest military depot in western Japan gone. 90,000 people dead before sunset, with tens of thousands more already dying from radiation effects that no doctor on Earth has the knowledge or equipment to treat. And the official language coming out of Tokyo is considerable damage. Now you need to understand the man at the center of this decision. War Minister Korechika Anami is not a man who fails to grasp what has happened. When the Truman transcript lands on his desk, he reads it. He understands it. And then he makes a choice that is almost incomprehensible from any angle except the one that makes sense inside the institution he has served his entire adult life. If the Army publicly acknowledges that a single bomb destroyed a major Japanese city, the logical foundation of their entire strategy collapses instantly. The strategy is this: hold. The home islands bleed the American invasion force on the beaches, negotiate from strength. One bomb does not fit that strategy. One bomb that can level a city every 3 days makes the strategy not just difficult, but delusional. Anami cannot accept that, not yet. Not without scientific confirmation. Not without something that lets him construct a different argument. So he orders his scientists to assess whether the weapon is genuinely atomic. The assessment will take until August 8th. 2 days. 2 days in which the official position remains unchanged. 2 days in which no additional information reaches the Japanese public. 2 days in which the gap between what is known at the command level and what is being said publicly grows wider and wider. Meanwhile, on the morning of August 6th, a 23-year-old medical orderly named Mikio Hirota is doing inventory. He is stationed at Hiroshima's Second Army Field Hospital. He is not a doctor. He has completed 3 months of field medicine training and was assigned to the hospital primarily because he can read well enough to maintain pharmaceutical records. His job that morning is counting bandages, logging morphine supplies, standard work, the kind of work that fills the hours of a young man who expected his war to be more dramatic than this. The flash comes through the window before the sound does. Masutai. He describes it later in testimony gathered by American researchers in 1946 as the inside of the building becoming white. Not bright. White. As though the air itself had been replaced by something luminous and total. Then the pressure wave hits the walls, and the building, which is reinforced concrete, one of the structures that partially survives, shakes in a way he says feels less like an explosion and more like the earth-changing shape beneath it. He is not seriously injured. That is luck of position. He has been standing in a corridor away from the windows when the detonation occurs. Many of the patients already in the wards are not as fortunate. The pressure wave drives glass horizontally through anyone near an unshuttered window. The field hospital designed to treat conventional war wounds becomes in approximately 4 seconds a casualty site of its own. Hirota does what his training tells him to do. He begins triage. He moves through the wards assessing who needs immediate attention, who can wait, who cannot be helped. This is the framework he has. This is what 3 months of training has given him. Categorize. Prioritize. Act. The problem is that the categories do not work. The patients coming in from outside, from the streets, from collapsed buildings, from the burning zones at the edge of the blast radius, do not present with wounds his training has named. They have burns unlike any burn pattern in his manual. Not the localized burns of incendiary attack, where fire contacts skin in a linear or scattered pattern. These burns are directional. One side of a person's body completely destroyed the other side untouched. as though the heat came from a single point in the sky and traveled in a straight line through everything between that point and the person's exposed surface. Some survivors have no visible wounds at all. They walk into the hospital under their own power. They report feeling unwell, and within hours their hair begins falling out and they cannot stop vomiting. Hirota has no category for this. Nothing in his training describes a wound that produces no external damage and kills from the inside. He treats what he can treat. Burns get bandaging where there are bandages. Pain gets morphine where there is morphine. Both supplies are gone within 3 hours of the detonation. After that, he does what every surviving medical worker in Hiroshima is doing that day. He uses water. He uses whatever fabric can be torn into strips. He talks to people. He holds hands. He keeps moving because stopping means acknowledging that the scale of what surrounds him is beyond any response he is capable of mounting. By late afternoon, the hospital has received more patients than it treated in the previous 6 months combined. Back in Tokyo, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Fuji has already seen the city from altitude. He is the officer ordered to fly to Hiroshima personally and report what he finds. He boards his aircraft in Tokyo that morning, flies southwest toward a city he has visited before, a city he knows, a city with streets and markets and hospitals and schools. From altitude, he sees the smoke column long before he can see anything else. He circles. He looks down. And then he circles again, because the first pass has not given his brain enough time to process what his eyes are sending it. And the city center is not damaged. It is flat, gray, featureless. A landscape that looks less like a bombed city and more like a table. Everything that gave Hiroshima its shape, its buildings, its bridges, its neighborhoods, its density, has been compressed into a layer of ash and rubble, so uniform it barely casts shadows. Fuji does not land immediately. The fires in the outer zones are still active. He circles one more time, transmitting observations as fast as he can form sentences, and then turns back toward the nearest functioning airfield. His full report reaches Tokyo by early evening. Total destruction across the central zone. Casualties in the tens of thousands at minimum. Command infrastructure of the Second Army effectively eliminated. The cause cannot be determined from aerial observation, but no conventional weapon or combination of weapons can account for what is visible from altitude. The Army receives this report, reads it, files it, and releases no additional public statement that night. On August 7th, the follow-up communique from Imperial General Headquarters acknowledges enormous damage and describes the weapon as causing considerable casualties. Still no name, still no scale. Still nothing about the obliteration of the regional command structure. Just considerable casualties. Meanwhile, Truman's broadcast is being repeated on American and Allied radio stations every few hours. The phrase atomic bomb is now in global circulation. Japanese citizens with shortwave receivers are hearing it in their homes. The Army can control its own newspapers. It cannot control the sky. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo is reading the same transcripts, sitting in the same government, and arriving at a completely different conclusion. He pushes immediately for an emergency cabinet session. He requests an urgent audience with Prime Minister Suzuki. He argues clearly and directly that the situation has already changed, that the atomic bomb has fundamentally altered the logic of continued resistance, and that the government must respond. Anami blocks it. Not with force, with procedure, with the institutional weight of the Army's position, which is the dominant voice in any room it enters. Whilst the scientists have not confirmed the weapon's nature. Wait for confirmation. Maintain the official position. Do not treat a single event as a turning point before we understand it fully. In the ruins of Hiroshima, Mikio Hirota is still working. He has not stopped since 8:16 that morning. He is tearing bedsheets into strips. He is filling whatever containers remain intact with water from a standpipe that somehow still functions at the hospital's eastern wall. He is watching people die from invisible wounds, and he is writing down what he sees in the pharmaceutical record book that was the only official document he thought to grab when the building shook. Name, approximate age, symptoms, time of death, over and over, because that is what his training gave him, the discipline of the record. He does not know that what he is documenting has never been documented before. He does not know that the invisible component of the weapon, the thing that is making people's hair fall out, that is destroying them from the cellular level upward, has a name that the Japanese medical system has never been given access to. He does not know that the Army's scientists in Tokyo are at this moment confirming the exact mechanism of what he is watching, and that confirmation is being used not to send him information or equipment or reinforcement, but to construct an argument about whether the war should continue. The confirmation arrives on August 8th. The weapon is atomic. The burn patterns, the yield, the radiation effects, all of it consistent with a uranium fission device. There is no longer any scientific uncertainty. The Army's own experts have confirmed what Truman announced 2 days earlier. Anami receives the confirmation, gathers the cabinet, and argues again for continuing the war. At the exact moment that argument is being made, in Tokyo, Soviet forces are crossing into Manchuria. The largest remaining Japanese field army is about to be hit on multiple fronts by a force that just finished destroying the German military, and the cabinet meeting ends without a decision. 18 hours later, a second atomic bomb falls on Nagasaki. The army spent 3 days arguing about one bomb. Now there are two. And somewhere in the ruins of Hiroshima, a 23-year-old medical orderly with a pharmaceutical record book is the only person in the entire Japanese institutional structure who is responding to reality with the full weight of everything he has. Not because he is more courageous than the men in Tokyo, because he has nothing left to protect except the people in front of him. That gap between the full report that arrived on the evening of August 6th and the 4 lines the war diary recorded in response is not a gap of information. It is a gap of institutional will. And in Part 2, we will watch that gap kill a city. The Supreme War Council is deadlocked. 3 members support exploring surrender. 3 oppose it. A system designed to prevent rash decisions has become a machine for producing paralysis at the worst possible moment in the nation's history. Nagasaki is gone. The Soviets are moving. And the men who can end this are still arguing about vocabulary. But there is one mechanism left. One that bypasses the deadlock entirely. And the man who finds it is not a general or a minister. He is the man closest to a throne that has not spoken publicly in the entire history of modern Japan. What happens next changes everything, and it starts in a bunker beneath the Imperial Palace at midnight. In Part 1, we watch Japan's military leadership receive confirmation of the most destructive weapon in human history and respond with 4 lines in a war diary. Hiroshima was gone. The Army's scientists had confirmed it was atomic. And War Minister Anami sat in a cabinet meeting on August 8th and argued with complete seriousness for continuing the war. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked. 3 members for surrender, 3 against. A system designed to prevent rash decisions had become a machine for producing paralysis. But here is the number that should stop you cold. Between the moment Japan's army confirmed the atomic nature of the Hiroshima bomb on August 8th and the moment the second bomb fell on Nagasaki on August 9th, exactly 19 hours and 2 minutes passed. 19 hours in which the Supreme War Council met, argued, deadlocked, and adjourned without a decision. 19 hours that Nagasaki did not have. And now, with 2 cities gone and the Soviets crossing into Manchuria, the men blocking Japan's surrender are about to face the one mechanism they cannot procedurally block. And this is where everything gets significantly worse before it gets better. The men blocking Japan's surrender in the days after Hiroshima were not stupid. That is the detail history tends to gloss over because it makes the story more complicated and less satisfying. War Minister Anami was not ignorant, not delusional, not disconnected from reality. He was a decorated military commander who understood the situation with painful clarity. He simply believed with the kind of institutional conviction that comes from spending an entire career inside one system that the system's logic still held. The Army's strategy since spring 1945 had been built on a single premise: make the American invasion of the Japanese home islands so costly, so brutal, so saturated with Japanese blood and American blood both, that Washington would negotiate rather than continue. The operation had a name: Ketsugo, and the numbers behind it were not fantasy. American planners estimated casualties in the hundreds of thousands for Operation Downfall. Some estimates went higher. The beaches of Kyushu were being prepared with every weapon Japan had left: kamikaze aircraft, suicide boats, soldiers armed with bamboo spears ordered to throw themselves under American tanks. Anami believed the Americans would blink first. He believed this even after Hiroshima. He believed it even after his own scientists confirmed the atomic weapon. Because in his framework, one bomb, even an atomic bomb, did not change the fundamental equation of invasion. It changed the scale of air attack. It did not change the calculation on the beaches. But on August 9th, he stated it directly in cabinet. If we surrender now, we surrender before the invasion has been tested. We give up our only leverage before we know what it costs them. Foreign Minister Togo's response was immediate. Minister Anami, they have demonstrated they do not need an invasion. They can destroy a city every 3 days with a single aircraft. There is nothing left to test. The room did not resolve. It never resolved when those two men were in it. That was the structural problem at the center of everything. Japan's Supreme War Council, the Big Six, required consensus for major decisions. 3 members supported exploring surrender. 3 opposed it. A system designed to prevent rash unilateral action had become a machine for producing paralysis at the worst possible moment in the nation's history. And while the machine ran, the clock kept moving. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had crossed into Manchuria. This detail tends to get lost in the atomic bomb narrative, but the men in that cabinet room understood its weight immediately. The Kwantung Army, Japan's largest remaining field force, the institution that had conquered Manchuria, the backbone of Japanese military power in Asia, was being hit on multiple fronts simultaneously by a Soviet force that had just finished destroying the Wehrmacht, not weakened German divisions. The core of the Red Army transferred east, rested resupplied, and now moving at a pace the Kwantung Army could not match. Japan had been counting on Soviet neutrality, not as a hope, as a strategy. There had been quiet diplomatic feelers through Moscow for months, attempts to use Soviet mediation to reach a negotiated settlement with the Americans. Those feelers were now irrelevant. The Soviets were not mediators. They were a third front. And the cabinet meeting on August 9th ended without a decision anyway. 18 hours after that meeting adjourned, the bomb fell on Nagasaki. Togo saw the full picture and moved faster than the institution could stop him. On August 9th, he did not wait for another cabinet deadlock. He went to Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido, the man closest to Emperor Hirohito, and made an argument that bypassed the military entirely. The constitutional framework of Japan gave the emperor ultimate authority. That authority was almost never exercised directly. The entire political system had evolved to operate without it. But the mechanism existed. If the emperor spoke formally in an imperial conference, his word could not be procedurally blocked by a deadlocked council. Kido understood. He had been watching the deterioration since August 6th with a clarity that the military's institutional filters had prevented Anami from achieving. He drafted the proposal for an imperial conference that same day. The conference was called for just after midnight. The early hours of August 10th, in a bunker beneath the imperial palace. The men who filed into that room carried the full weight of what had happened in the preceding 4 days. 2 atomic bombs, a Soviet invasion, Nagasaki gone, and a council that had met repeatedly and produced nothing. Anami spoke first. His argument was the same argument he had made on August 8th. The home island defense still held. The invasion had not been tested. Surrender before the beaches were fought was surrender without leverage. His voice in that room was still the voice of the institution that had run Japan since 1931, and it carried the full force of that history. Togo spoke. His argument was also the same, but the evidence behind it had grown by one destroyed city and one Soviet invasion since he had last made it. The room could not resolve itself. These men had been unable to resolve themselves for 4 days. What was different was the man at the center of the table. Hirohito spoke. He did not make a military argument. He did not make a strategic argument. He spoke about reality as he understood it. The plan to defend the home islands required soldiers who could fight civilians who could survive, and a country that would exist after the war ended. He was not certain, he said, that any of those conditions still obtained. He was not certain that the suffering his people had already endured could be multiplied further on the beaches of Kyushu and still produce a country at the end of it. He accepted the Potsdam Declaration. One condition: the preservation of the imperial institution. The emperor must remain. The transmission went out through Switzerland and Sweden on August 10th. The American response arrived on August 11th. The emperor would remain, but his authority would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. Not unconditional preservation, but preservation. And the debate inside the cabinet continued even after that. A faction within the army still argued for rejection. There were officers openly discussing refusal to implement surrender orders, continuation of resistance, regardless of government decisions. The system that had produced paralysis for 4 days now produced something more dangerous. Men who had decided that the emperor's word formally spoken was less authoritative than their own conviction. On the night of August 14th, a group of junior officers moved through the imperial palace, attempting to seize the recorded surrender rescript before it could be broadcast. They searched for hours. They interrogated palace officials. They moved through storage rooms in the dark. The recording had been hidden well. They did not find it. By morning, the senior officers involved had recognized that the attempt had failed and would not be repeated. Some took their own lives. Others surrendered to military police. The coup had failed. But the fact that it happened at all tells you something important about the institution that had managed Japan's war. These were not rogue actors. They were products of a culture that had spent years teaching its soldiers that institutional survival was more important than any individual decision, any individual order, any individual life. The same culture that had spent 8 days arguing about vocabulary while cities burned had also produced men who believed that preventing surrender was worth a coup attempt inside the imperial palace. They failed. The recording was found. The broadcast went forward. At noon on August 15th, Japanese radio played the emperor's voice for the first time in the nation's history. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. He spoke of accepting the general trends of the world. He did not say the word surrender. Even in the final statement, the gap between official language and plain reality held. War Minister Anami did not hear the broadcast. He had taken his own life in the early hours of August 15th before it aired. His farewell note expressed apology to the emperor. It asked forgiveness for his errors. It did not recant his position on the war. Even at the end, the institution spoke louder than the evidence. Back in Hiroshima, Mikio Hirota was still working. He had not stopped working since the morning of August 6th. He would continue working through August and September and into the autumn as the slow deaths from radiation continued among people who had walked into the hospital under their own power and showed no visible wounds. He would not learn until American researchers arrived with Geiger counters and medical literature that what he had been watching was acute radiation syndrome. He would not learn until then that the invisible component of the weapon had a name, a mechanism, a documented process of progression that the Japanese medical system had never been given access to. He kept tearing fabric into strips. He kept filling containers with water. He kept writing in the pharmaceutical record book because that was what his training had given him, and he did not have anything else. The official language out of Tokyo mentioned fire and blast damage. It mentioned considerable casualties. It did not mention radiation. Because the Army did not yet understand radiation as a category of damage. Because the scientific assessment was still being managed. In Hiroshima's ruined hospitals, people were dying from something nobody had officially named yet, and a 23-year-old orderly was the only person in the entire system creating a real record of what was actually happening. In Part 3, the American researchers arrive, and what they find in Hirota's record book, the patterns he documented, without a framework for understanding them, becomes the foundation for something that will outlast the war, outlast the institutions that failed, outlast every official statement and four-line diary entry produced by the men who chose the language over the reality. But first, they have to reckon with what those 8 days actually cost. And the accounting, when it finally begins, is going to be more precise and more damning than anything the war diary ever recorded. Because the cities burned, the institutions survived. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts is the most important lesson those 8 days left behind. In Part 1, we watched Japan's military leadership receive confirmation of an atomic weapon and respond with bureaucratic paralysis. In Part 2, we watched that paralysis hold through a second bomb, a Soviet invasion, and a cabinet deadlock that only broke when the emperor himself intervened at midnight in a bunker beneath the imperial palace. The surrender rescript was recorded. The coup attempt failed. And at noon on August 15th, Hirohito's voice went out over Japanese radio for the first time in history. But the broadcast ending the war did not end the story. And because here is what the official surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945 could not account for. Of the estimated 140,000 people who died in Hiroshima by the end of 1945, approximately 40,000 of them died after August 15th, after the surrender, after the war was officially over. They died from acute radiation syndrome, from infection from burns that no medical system in 1945 had the knowledge or equipment to treat. They died in hospitals where the staff was still using torn fabric and water because nobody had sent them anything better. The war ended. The dying did not. And this is where the story stops being about military strategy and starts being about something that matters more. When American forces arrived in Japan in September 1945, the strategic picture was already being processed by historians and analysts who would spend decades arguing about it. But on the ground in Hiroshima, a different kind of processing was underway. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, the ABCC, established in 1947, was the first systematic medical study of radiation effects on human survivors. Its researchers arrived with equipment that had never been used in a civilian disaster context. Geiger counters, dosimeters, medical literature from the Manhattan Project that the Japanese medical system had never been given access to. What they found when they began interviewing survivors was not chaos. It was documentation. Mikio Hirota had been writing since August 6th. His pharmaceutical record book, designed for logging morphine supplies and bandage inventories, had been repurposed in the first hours after the bomb into something entirely different. Name, approximate age, symptoms, time of presentation, time of death, the pattern of burns, whether wounds were visible or invisible, whether patients had walked in under their own power or been carried. He had no framework for what he was recording. He did not know what radiation was. He did not know that the people presenting with no visible wounds and progressive vomiting were experiencing acute radiation syndrome at varying stages of severity. He recorded it anyway, because that was what his training gave him, the discipline of the record. When the ABCC researchers sat down with him in 1946, they were looking for survivor accounts that could help them establish baseline data for radiation exposure effects. What Hirota handed them was not an account. It was a data set. Weeks of systematic observation recorded in the careful handwriting of a man trained to maintain pharmaceutical records applied to a category of damage that had never existed before August 6, 1945. The patterns he had documented without understanding their mechanism matched precisely with what the Manhattan Project's medical literature predicted radiation exposure would produce. The directional burns, the latency period between exposure and visible symptoms, The progression from initial apparent health through hair loss, vomiting, internal bleeding, and death in cases of high exposure. The survivorship patterns based on distance from the hypocenter. All of it was there in Hirota's record book, recorded by a 23-year-old orderly who had never heard the word radiation used in a medical context.
The
ABCC researchers understood immediately what they were looking at. This was not survivor testimony. This was the earliest systematic clinical record of acute radiation syndrome ever compiled. It predated any official medical documentation by weeks. It covered a patient population of hundreds, recorded at the point of care in real time by someone with enough training to observe consistently and enough discipline to keep writing even when what he was seeing had no name. His documentation became one of the foundational data sources for the ABCC's early research. The patterns he recorded, without a framework for understanding them, appear in the foundational literature on radiation medicine that shaped everything that followed: nuclear safety protocols, emergency response procedures, the training of medical personnel who would later work near reactors and test sites, the civilian nuclear infrastructure that grew from the same physics that produced the bomb. Every framework that was eventually built to protect people from radiation exposure has threads that lead back to the evidence compiled in the weeks after August 6th by people like Hirota, who saw something nobody had a name for and wrote it down anyway. That is not a small thing. That is how knowledge moves through catastrophe. Now consider what that means against the backdrop of the institutional failure that made Hirota's documentation necessary in the first place. The Tokyo Tribunal examined the cabinet records in detail beginning in 1946. The testimonies of surviving ministers reconstructed the deliberations with enough precision that historians have been able to trace meeting by meeting the exact point at which available information stopped producing appropriate action. What they found is not unique to Japan in 1945. It is a pattern that appears in institutional failures across different systems and different centuries. The pattern is this: institutions under pressure do not fail because information is absent. They fail because the available information threatens the institutional framework more than the problem it describes. Anami did not lack information about Hiroshima. He had Fuji's aerial report. He had survivor testimony. He had his own scientist's confirmation. What he lacked was a framework in which that information could produce action without destroying the institutional logic he had spent his career defending. So the information was received and classified and debated and used as the subject of further delay, because delay was the only response the framework could generate. And the 8 days between August 6th and August 14th are a precise documented case study in what that tendency costs when the stakes are the highest possible. 2 cities. 250,000 dead by the end of 1945, with estimates reaching higher when the radiation deaths of subsequent years are included. A surrender that came 8 days after the information that should have produced it was already in hand. Shigenori Togo, the foreign minister who pushed hardest for surrender and was blocked at every turn, survived the war. He gave detailed testimony at the Tokyo Tribunal about the cabinet meetings, the deadlocks, the arguments he made, and the arguments that overruled him. The tribunal convicted him of crimes against peace for his role in Japan's pre-war diplomacy and sentenced him to 20 years. He died in prison in 1955, 10 years after the surrender he had fought for finally came. He did not live to see his parole date. Koichi Kido, the man who found the constitutional mechanism to break the deadlock, received a life sentence. He was paroled in 1955. He lived until 1977, long enough to watch Japan rebuild itself into an economic power on the rubble of the cities the Army's institutional paralysis had failed to protect. General Shunroku Hata, commander of the Second Army, survived Hiroshima because he was at a location on the city's edge at the moment of detonation. Every member of his forward staff died within 400 meters of their posts. Hata was convicted at the tribunal, sentenced to life imprisonment, later paroled. He lived until 1962. For the rest of his life, he was one of the few senior officers who had been physically present in Hiroshima when the bomb fell, who had seen what the Army's language described as considerable damage, and who knew, with the specific knowledge of a man who had stood in the rubble, exactly what those words had been worth. And then there was Mikio Hirota, who appears in the American research records from 1946, who gave testimony about what he had treated in the hours after the bomb, who described the burns and the hair loss and the vomiting and the deaths from invisible wounds. He was not a general. He was not a cabinet minister. He held no rank that appears in the official histories. He had completed 3 months of field medicine training and had been assigned to the hospital primarily because he could read well enough to maintain pharmaceutical records. He was not credited by name in the major ABCC publications. That is not unusual. Survivor testimony in large medical studies rarely carries individual attribution. But the patterns he described in 1946 are the same patterns that appear in the foundational literature on radiation medicine. His particular contribution was not a discovery. It was documentation. He saw something nobody had a framework for, and he wrote it down anyway in the careful language of someone trained to maintain pharmaceutical records. And that documentation became one thread in the evidence that eventually produced the framework. Now here is the detail that once you know, it changes how you read the official language of those 8 days. The War Diary of Imperial General Headquarters for August 6, 1945, describes the destruction of Hiroshima in 4 lines. 4 lines for the obliteration of a city of 350,000 people. The entry notes, communication loss. A report of a large explosion. The dispatch of an investigative officer. It does not describe the weapon. It does not estimate casualties. It does not note that the Second Army's command structure has been eliminated. That document is publicly available. It is held in the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, accessible online. Anyone can read it. The 4 lines are exactly as described. Next to it in the same archive is Fuji's full report, the detailed aerial account of total destruction that arrived at General Headquarters that same evening. The full report exists. The 4-line diary entry exists. Both were created by the same institution on the same day, in response to the same event. The gap between them is not a gap of information, it is a gap of institutional will. That gap, precisely documented, permanently archived, freely accessible, is the most important thing those 8 days left behind. Not the bomb. The bomb was physics, not the surrender. The surrender was inevitable once the Emperor spoke. The most important legacy of August 6th through August 14th, 1945, is the 4-line war diary entry sitting next to the full report of the city it failed to describe. It is a precise and permanent record of what institutions do when reality threatens the framework more than the problem does. And in Part 4, we will ask the question that the official history still has not fully answered. What happened to the institutions themselves? What happened to the men who ran them? And what does a 23-year-old medical orderly with a pharmaceutical record book have to teach us about the only thing that has ever interrupted the mechanism that failed Hiroshima? And because the cities burned, the institution survived. And the gap between those two facts is still running somewhere right now, in a different language, in a different building, in a different century. The story is not over. It never was. We have spent 3 parts inside 8 days. August 6th to August 14th, 1945. We watched a weapon destroy a city in 43 seconds. We watched a government spend the next week arguing about what to call it. We watched the Emperor finally speak because no other mechanism was left. And we stood with a 23-year-old medical orderly in the ruins of Hiroshima, treating radiation wounds with torn fabric and water because nobody had told him what radiation was. Now comes the question every story like this eventually arrives at. What happened after? What happened to the people? What happened to the decisions? And what, if anything, did any of it mean beyond the specific coordinates of those 8 days? And because here is the truth that the official history tends to smooth over. The men who managed Japan's institutional language through those 8 days did not disappear when the war ended. Their choices did not disappear. The gap between what was known and what was said has a cost that can be counted, and the counting has never fully stopped. Mikio Hirota did not leave Hiroshima when the war ended. He had nowhere else to go, and the work was not finished. The hospital network he had been part of since August 6th was still functioning in the improvised way that disaster creates, with too few staff, too little equipment, and a patient population that kept dying from causes that the medical staff still did not have the vocabulary to describe accurately. He kept his record book going through September, through October, into the winter of 1945, when the deaths from acute radiation syndrome among those who had appeared to survive the initial blast were still occurring weeks and months after the detonation.
Gentlemen.
He was 23 years old, and he had been watching people die from an invisible wound for 4 months before anyone arrived with an explanation. The American researchers from the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission found him in early 1946, still working in what remained of the hospital network, still maintaining records, in the careful, methodical way his original training had given him. When they sat down with him and asked him to describe what he had seen, he did not describe it the way a traumatized witness describes a disaster. He described it the way someone trained to maintain pharmaceutical records describes a clinical phenomenon. Systematically. With dates and patterns and observable progressions. The researchers understood within the first hour of that conversation that what they were looking at was not survivor testimony. It was clinical documentation. Weeks of systematic observation compiled by someone who had no framework for what he was observing, but had the discipline to record it consistently anyway. The patterns Hirota had documented without understanding their mechanism matched precisely with what the Manhattan Project's medical literature predicted radiation exposure would produce. He had described acute radiation syndrome in accurate clinical detail months before anyone told him the syndrome had a name. He gave his record book to the researchers. They copied it entirely. The original, as far as the available record shows, was retained by the ABCC's documentation archive. His name appears in their internal records as a primary source informant. It does not appear in the major published studies. That is how large medical research works. The person who provides foundational data and the person who receives credit for the findings are almost never the same person. Hirota returned to civilian life after the occupation period. He trained formally as a nurse. He worked in Hiroshima's reconstructed medical system for the remainder of his career. He was not decorated. He was not promoted into any position that appears in the historical record. He was a man who had done something extraordinary under conditions that did not reward extraordinary things, and then continued doing ordinary things for the rest of his working life. There is a specific kind of dignity in that trajectory that the official histories are not designed to capture. But his particular contribution was not lost, even if his name was. The patterns he documented without a framework for understanding them appear in the foundational literature on radiation medicine that shaped everything that followed. Nuclear safety protocols developed for weapons testing in the 1950s drew on ABCC data that drew on Hirota's observations. Emergency response procedures for nuclear reactor accidents, including the frameworks developed after 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986, have structural roots in the clinical understanding of radiation syndrome that was first systematically documented in Hiroshima in the weeks after August 6, 1945. The 1986 Chernobyl response trained medical personnel specifically on the progression of acute radiation syndrome, on the latency period between exposure and visible symptoms, on the specific pattern of hair loss and gastrointestinal failure that Hirota had recorded in his pharmaceutical book 4 decades earlier, without knowing what any of it meant. The framework that protected the Chernobyl cleanup workers who survived was built partly on evidence that originated in a hospital with no supplies maintained by a man who was tearing bedsheets into strips because the bandages had run out. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual lineage of the knowledge. Right. Now consider what runs alongside that lineage. The institutional failure that made Hirota's documentation necessary in the first place did not end with the surrender. The men who produced it faced accountability of varying kinds, but the pattern itself, the tendency of institutions under pressure to manage information, rather than act on it to protect the institutional position, rather than respond to the reality. The position was created to address that pattern, did not end in 1945. It has never ended. It is structural. The Tokyo Tribunal documented the cabinet deliberations in detail. What the record shows is not a story of villains who knew the right thing and chose the wrong thing for personal gain. It is a story of men so completely formed by an institution that they could not perceive reality outside its framework. Anami was not protecting himself when he spent 3 days arguing about vocabulary after Hiroshima. He was protecting the only logic system he had ever inhabited. The institution was not a tool he used. It was the lens through which everything he saw was filtered and processed and returned to him as something manageable. When that lens could not process the bomb, it did not break. It produced delay. It produced the 4-line diary entry. It produced the word considerable. Because delay and euphemism were the only outputs available to a system that could not acknowledge what would happen to itself if it acknowledged the truth. This is the the lesson that the 8 days between Hiroshima and the surrender rescript contain. Not a lesson about military strategy. Not a lesson about atomic weapons. A lesson about what happens inside any institution, military, governmental, corporate, medical, when the available information threatens the framework more than the problem it describes. The information does not disappear. It gets managed. It gets filed. It gets described in language that reduces its weight until the weight becomes bearable within the existing structure. And somewhere outside that structure, someone with a record book and not enough bandages is documenting what the language is failing to say. The War Diary of Imperial General Headquarters for August 6, 1945, describes the destruction of Hiroshima in 4 lines. 4 lines for the obliteration of a city of 350,000 people. That document is publicly available, held in the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The 4 lines are exactly as described. Next to it in the same archive is Fuji's full report, the detailed aerial account of total destruction that arrived at General Headquarters that same evening. The full report exists. The 4-line entry exists. Both created by the same institution on the same day, in response to the same event. The gap between them is not a gap of information. It is a gap of will. And here is the detail that most accounts of this story do not include the detail that once you know it, changes how you read everything that came before. When American archivists and historians began systematically digitizing Japan's wartime records in the 1990s and early 2000s, they found that the War Diary entry for August 6th was not the only document with this characteristic. Across multiple branches of Imperial General Headquarters, the documents produced on August 6th and 7th show a consistent pattern. The internal communications, the ones not intended for public release or official record, describe the destruction with considerable accuracy. Total obliteration. Unprecedented weapon. Unknown casualties in the tens of thousands. One staff officer's private notation on August 7th reads simply in translation, "The city is gone." The city is gone. That notation exists in the same archive as the official communiqué describing considerable damage. Written by people in the same building, on the same day, about the same event. The private language and the official language are not even in the same category. They describe different realities. One is what people saw and knew and wrote when they were writing for themselves. The other is what the institution could permit itself to say. The gap between those 2 documents is the most precisely documented example in the historical record of the mechanism by which institutions process unbearable information. It is not concealment in the way that word is usually used, implying a deliberate conspiracy to hide truth from the people. It is something more automatic and more dangerous than that. It is a system generating the only outputs its framework permits, even when those outputs have no relationship to the reality the system nominally exists to address. The cities burned, the institutions survived, and the private notation that said the city is gone sat in the same archive as the official language that said considerable damage, separated by the thickness of a folder for 50 years before anyone digitized them and placed them next to each other on the same screen. When the people who had the power to act had all the information they needed by August 8th. They chose the 4-line entry. Tens of thousands of people in Nagasaki paid the difference. And Mikio Hirota, who had no power at all, who could not change the cabinet's language or break the army's deadlock or stop the second bomb from falling, kept a pharmaceutical record book and filled it with what he saw because that was the only thing available to him, and it turned out to be the most durable thing produced in Hiroshima in those 8 days. More durable than the institutional position Anami died defending. More durable than the official language that described 5 square miles of obliteration as considerable damage. More durable than the careers and convictions of every man in that cabinet room who chose the framework over the evidence. The record book outlasted all of it. That is why this story is worth telling, not because it ended in a way that justice would design. Togo died in prison 5 years after the surrender he spent his career trying to achieve. Hirota received no credit in the publications his observations made possible. Nagasaki happened anyway because 19 hours was not enough time for an institution to overcome itself. None of that is satisfying in the way that stories are supposed to be satisfying. No, but the mechanism is documented. The 4-line entry and the full report exist in the same archive. The private notation and the official communique sit in the same folder. The pharmaceutical record book and the foundational ABCC research that it fed into are both part of the permanent record. The gap between what was known and what was said is not speculation. It is archived, digitized, freely accessible, and precise. And every institution operating right now in every language, in every country, in every sector contains the same structural vulnerability. The tendency to manage information rather than act on it. The tendency to produce language that the framework can absorb, rather than language that describes what is actually happening. The tendency to generate 4-line entries for events that require full reports. The only thing that has ever interrupted that mechanism is exactly what Hirota did. Write it down, even without a framework for what you are seeing, especially without a framework. Document the pattern before you have the vocabulary for the mechanism. Keep the record even when the institution is producing language that contradicts it. Because the record is what survives when the institutional logic finally fails, and it always eventually fails, and when it does, the record is what makes it possible to understand what happened and build something better from the evidence. From a 23-year-old medical orderly with a pharmaceutical record book and no bandages left to the foundational clinical literature on radiation syndrome that has protected human lives across 8 decades and counting. That is what documentation does when institutional language fails. The cities burned, the record survived, and that finally is the difference between the 4 lines and the truth.